Hello and welcome to another bonus episode. When I interviewed Melonie Johnson for episode number 552, I was surprised to learn that we were both reading the same book, All the Living and the Dead by Hayley Campbell. So I invited her to come back and talk at length about it, and this is our deep dive. But I have a few warnings, and this is very important. This book is about death and the people who work in and around the dead. And this may not be an episode for you, and that is okay. The only thing I want most of all is for you to feel safe while you listen. I also want to specifically mention that at about 15 minutes in, we talk about a chapter that explores bereavement wards in hospitals and about pregnancy loss. This is a beautifully written book, but it's not for everyone, and neither is this episode probably. But if you are curious about the people who work in very different industries and share a very real sense of empathy and care for the dead, you might like this book and this conversation. Thank you so much for being part of the podcast Patreon. I am so honored to have your support. And speaking of things that are dying, a lot of media is going through layoffs or closing down publications altogether. And I want to reiterate how much your support means now. It is immeasurable. So thank you. Let's get to my deep dive into All the Living and the Dead with Melonie Johnson. Okay, so you are back, and we are going to talk about the book that is all about death.
Yes, the death book, yeah.
Okay, so I figured the easiest way to introduce this book to people who may be listening who may not have heard of it is to just share the cover copy. And then I have some questions, and we're going to talk about it, sort of like a mini 2-person book club.
Sounds good.
So this book is not for everyone, and I need everyone to know that. So this is by an author named Hayley Campbell, who I think did a fantastic job with this book. And the cover copy reads, "We are surrounded by death. It is in our news, our nursery rhymes, our true crime podcasts. And yet from a young age, we are told that death is something to be feared. How are we supposed to know what we're so afraid of when we're never given the chance to look?" Fueled by a childhood fascination with death, journalist Hayley Campbell searches for answers in the people who make a living by working with the dead. Along the way, she encounters mass fatality investigators, embalmers, and a former executioner who's responsible for ending 62 lives. That was an interesting chapter. She meets grave diggers, visits a cryonics facility, goes for late-night Chinese with a homicide detective, and questions a man whose job it is to make a crime scene disappear. Through Campbell's incisive and candid interviews with these people who see death every day, she asks, why would someone choose this kind of life? Does it change who you are? And are we missing something vital by letting death remain hidden? Okay, so what made you pick up this book, Melonie?
I had written a book recently in which the hero's family owned a funeral home. So I have been doing research about funeral homes and the process of, people whose death is a part of their daily lives, dealing with death and the grieving process. And then also, other rabbit holes about various types of burial options that are now becoming more discussed, green burials that there's a lot of research being done on. And it led me to finding this book, All the Living and the Dead. It kind of popped up in a search and I'm like, well, that's interesting. And it was a Goodreads, the best books nominees. So I'm like, and nonfiction, I always forget that nonfiction can be so compelling.
Oh gosh, this was such a good narrative. Like the first thing I want to say beyond we're talking about death, and in the book there's death of children, there's murder, homicide, discussion of violent crime, suicide. And I think this is the kind of book where you have to have arrived at a certain understanding or comfort with death in order to investigate this deeply into the specifics of what happens after you're dead. And I know, for example, in my life, there are a lot of people who don't want to talk about death at all. Like, nope, we don't talk about that at all. This is not a book for them.
Honestly, in a strange way, I think it is the perfect book for them, though. They would have to come to it on their own. Because I was gonna say that I think having some personal experience with death will open you up to understanding this book in a way that you may not otherwise. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think because I've read the Mary Roach book, Stiff, and I've read other books about death, the algorithm was like, hey, there's another book for you. I think that's how I found it, or it was recommended. But
yeah, I should have asked, like, how did you come across?
I believe that it was recommended to me by an algorithm, and then someone else mentioned it in reference to other narrative nonfiction about science and what happens in your body that I've read. So I think that this was a mix of a recommendation and algorithm, but the hold at the library was significant enough. So you mentioned that it was a Goodreads best book. When I look at the library hold, I'm like, oh, everybody wants this book. Me too. I follow library holds. It's kind of embarrassing.
No, actually,
The hold for this
I
is
think
9
that's
years.
intriguing. Now I'm curious because that's something I don't think we should track that more books, how many books that a library carries and their holds. But that definitely says something too. And it says like, I got mine from the library as well, because that's like I want to read this book. I do not know if I want to own this book. Is that like
Yes. What did you think overall of this book?
So, I mean, I approach this, my English major brain turns on. So I approach this in a way, like if I were to have to like come up with a thesis for this book and where my kind of starting point would be to talk about it, there was a quote in the book. And forgive me, but I didn't write down because she's quoting someone else. Compassion is an unstable emotion. It needs to be translated into action or it withers. And I think that would be my thesis for this entire book, and what we see reflected, not reflected in every single, because she kind of like breaks the book into interviews of these different career paths where people are dealing in death.
Yes.
And in every case, this idea of compassion, of humanity, and how these people approach death and deal with it being so interwoven into their lives, we keep that and so I think that kind of summarizes the book for me, and that how it needs to be translated into action, into what these people are doing, and then the choices they make and the acts that they do, or how that compassion can wither.
For me, the quote that I highlighted thinking, okay, this is it, this is the book, is actually the last paragraph. When, so the book was written and I think she was finishing it during lockdown, and she's English. So, their lockdown was a lot more limiting than anything that we experienced in the United States. But the last paragraph reads, "We've always had death. We've just avoided its gaze. We hide it so we can forget it, but we can go on believing it won't happen to us. But during the pandemic, death felt closer and possible and everywhere to everyone. We are the survivors of an era defined by death. We will have to move the furniture of our minds to accommodate this newly visible guest."
No, that struck with me as well. And actually that thing about moving the furniture of our minds kind of goes back to one of the chapters that I thought about the most, which we can get into at some point. The mental gymnastics that people can go through.
Yeah. And first of all, the writing is so good. I think the chapters that stuck with me the most were the chapters. One was about the company that is basically a white label company that comes into.
That was fascinating.
Okay. So there is a company, it was called Kenyon, right?
Yeah.
They exist, but they become part of a company that has a disaster that involves the cleanup or dealing with mass casualty events, whether it's a country that's had an earthquake or a typhoon, or it's a airline that's had a plane crash. They are the ones who set up the special website for people who are looking for information, who go out and do the physical work of cleaning up a site. That was absolutely fascinating. And they don't exist as their own company. They become part of the other company while the disaster is being managed, whether it's, Lufthansa or US Air or, the entire country of the Philippines after a typhoon. That was absolutely fascinating, that these were people whose job it was to go clean up mass disasters.
Yeah, I had several notes on that because I was, my writer brain just lit up like with plot bunnies galore, because the jobs that, the multitude of jobs working in a company like that, but also just something I never really even thought about. But that is like, compassion is really at the heart of what this company does in so many ways. And talking about how to make sure that if they have a hotel where families of victims are waiting, that they're not like at a place where there's a wedding happening, or they make sure meals are scheduled when people celebrating are not having them. Like, they really take care of those details.
Okay, first of all, I Googled so many different disasters in that chapter. Like, there were things that were mentioned that I Googled so much. Like, my Google search history is now deeply morbid. If you are looking at my search history, I had not heard of some of these disasters. And it's kind of wild like you were talking about the compassion in the details of helping a company and the people affected by this disaster, helping them cope and process. There is so much compassion there, but essentially what they're doing is managing the public relations of a disaster.
Yeah, so it's like it's a PR firm.
Right? It's a PR firm with a science wing, and yet you don't usually say PR and compassion in the same sentence. Like those two things don't usually go together. They are constantly aware that they are dealing essentially with individual people, the people who have died and the people who are connected to the people who have died. And they keep that in the center of what they're doing, even though they are dealing with some of the worst disasters and things that happen to people.
The journalist who writes the book goes to what they have called the open day, where it's kind of like, it's like their sales pitch day, because again, it is a business and they're trying to show these companies, airlines, cruises, whatnot, like this is why you need us and you want us before the disaster strikes because we're ready to go.
The other chapter that I found the most compelling and also the hardest to read was when the author is visiting a pathology lab, and they are trying to figure out the cause of death for different people. So much of the people who do this work, their work is not acknowledged. So there were a couple of things happening in this chapter. Basically, each chapter takes the form that Hayley Campbell will go into this field and will start talking to an individual who does this work and does a very in-depth conversational interview with them, but also gives you the larger context of what is the work that they do, who do they do it for, why do they do it? And what is the effect of that work on them? And then I think she realizes as she's doing this work, what is the effect of learning about all these jobs? How is that affecting her? Because the thing about being alive is that you have to keep processing death. It's kind of a conundrum. So in the pathology lab in the UK, she's talking about how after an attack in London where someone had, I think, run across a bridge and stabbed a bunch of people, was just on a stabbing frenzy.
Right. It was there were the vans that had run over people. Then there were all the guys that got out with the knives. Yeah.
Yeah. It was some sort of horrible terrorist attack. And that was the hospital that had received a lot of the victims. And the pathologist was saying, they got up and they thanked the nurses and they thanked the janitors and they thanked the people who cleaned up and they thanked the people who worked in reception. And not a single person mentioned us and the work that we did, because we had to determine the cause of death. We had to do autopsies and investigative explorations into the people who had died. And we were not mentioned. We were just completely forgotten, and how hurt and demoralized this person felt. Because my goodness, first of all, the level of expertise you have to be able to, crack open a body and be like, oh, well, there it is. That's the reason. This is what's happened. That's an incredibly skilled thing. And I really felt for that person. Like, our work is never mentioned. The other thing that I valued so much about this book was how each of the people that she profiled, even if I didn't understand how they did what they did professionally, all of them cared very deeply about the work that they were doing. A lot of them made a lot of tiny decisions to preserve the identity and the dignity of the body that they were working on. To them, it is no longer a person. What made it a person has gone. But what is left behind still needs dignity and care. And so much care is put into the work. What the writer, what Hayley Campbell says is that what sticks is not the sadness, which can be cumulative. What sticks are the stories of people doing the good and right thing, even though no one will ever notice and no one will ever know.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to kind of like my thesis, if I was writing this, and the examples that I would pull to demonstrate, that about it being compassion and it being needed to translate into action. And from the first chapter forward, she will show us these examples of what these people have done. And like you said, nobody has to know, and it is the fact that nobody knows that makes it so important. From the undertaker who will has a collection of like underpants and socks for people that the families forget to bring those things, to put them on them when nobody else will know, but he does, and he will make sure that that's done. Well, and you're talking about care, and in this case, because the chapter that we were just talking about with the pathologists, and then the following chapter is kind of like the rabbit hole she went down, kind of going down this path of learning about bereavement.
Bereavement wards for people who have
Thank
lost
you.
pregnancies. Yes.
Yeah.
That so few people who work in birth, in labor and delivery, are trained in bereavement is astonishing
That
to me.
shocked me. So two statistics shocked me. One, that 1 in 4 pregnancies ends in death, whether it be during gestation or actual birth, like 1 in 4. And only 12% of neonatal units have bereavement training. That also was staggering. And which also, I mean, I'm not surprised because people just don't think about this. And the woman she interviewed who does this, who is a doula or a midwife, and and her job is basically to have to deliver either babies that have already passed in the womb or are not going to have their life will not be sustainable past a few minutes.
And that this one hospital has a separate ward called the Eden ward, but most women who are going through a preterm delivery that will end in death or are dealing with a stillbirth, they're delivering in the same ward as all of these people where they're hearing live births and families and babies. And I cannot imagine how traumatic that is, that there's not the possibility of separating that experience except in very select locations. And that whole chapter made my chest hurt. It made my chest hurt. It made my tummy hurt. But at the same time, I was so thankful that there were people like the person who was being profiled who do this work and help people process this experience. Like I said, coming up to someone going through the worst moment of your life and having that person say, I know what to do and I know how to help you.
Yeah. And that's exactly how she kind of fell into it, was like someone needs to help these people get through this. And there's all of these different things that, again, like you don't want to think about because you don't want to think about it happening to you, kind of situation. And it needs to be talked about more.
You were saying when we did our other interview, you were saying that reading this before bed was like very Wednesday Addams. And it is a heavy read. Like there were some chapters where I was like, I should not have this be the last thing I read before I go to bed. I'm going to switch over to like a standby book that I can read before bed. And most chapters were fine, but there were a couple where I was like, this is not something I can put in my brain before.
It was hard, but I think like you mentioned, knowing that there are people out there doing those things is comforting in a way that is because we do need to, I mean, like death is all around us and we do need to look at it in a way that is. Yeah. When what we've gone through in these past couple of years.
What effect did reading this book have on you? What mental furniture did you need to move around having read this book? Because it's weird. Like I was so excited when you said you were reading it because I was like, oh, I could talk to somebody about this book in detail and be like, the chapter with the crime scene guy. What the hell? Like this is not a book that I could be like, oh yes, everyone should read this. This is universally appealing. This is not universally appealing.
Yeah, everyone will experience death in one way or another in their lives. So this does apply. This is universal. I found a couple of things that stuck with me. One, I didn't know what this book was going to do or where it was going to go when it opened, because it opened with her childhood obsession with death.
Yes.
It opened with her kind of fascination with death. And I was like, I wasn't sure like how I was going to feel about it. If it was but it really moved away from that. And it kind of, again, focused on this, that there's a difference in fascination with death stemming from a fear or stemming from a need to understand it. And as she herself, Hayley, the author herself, kind of went through, she realized her fascination came from a deep need to understand it.
Yeah.
And then she used the example of the artist Andy Warhol as someone who was fascinated with death more out of fear.
Yeah.
And that he was so afraid of death and all of it that he would not even go to his own mother's funeral. But those pieces of it really struck me what was it about this that I became fascinated with? And I think the piece for me was not so much trying to understand death itself, but more understand how we process it.
Yes, especially because like she says at the end of the book, we are going through a massive amount of death right now, and it's still happening every day. And we haven't mourned. And
having lost my father and having gone through a grieving process and having close friends lose husbands and things like that and watching that grieving process. And I think compassion, it really is the heart of it.
Yeah. It is really important to acknowledge how a loss has affected you as a living person. And I think for me, what this book really did was, well, it made me a lot more sanguine about little problems. Like,
well, yeah,
people are dying, Kim, like literally people are dying. And one of the things that Campbell wrote that I highlight is life is meaningful because it ends. We are very brief blips on a long timeline, colliding with other people, unlikely collections of atoms and energy that somehow existed at the same time we did.
Yeah.
That kind of puts a lot of the things I worry about in a larger context where I can be like, yeah, maybe I can let that go. Not that I need to now fixate on something else, which is something my brain absolutely loves
Which is
to do.
so interesting that you say that, because I feel like, have gone through the last couple of years and having death be everywhere, I feel like we are in an era of nobody gives a fuck. And I feel like it's this weird place where, I don't, maybe it is like letting go of the stuff that isn't important.
Right.
Or I'm not like,
what do you mean by nobody gives a fuck? Do you mean like people are behaving so terribly without consequence?
Yeah, I feel like people behaving in a way that's terrible. People behaving in a way like that just not putting care into basic everyday things. And is it this a complete, like, we've just turned off our ability to care for things, or is it that like it's so unimportant in the bigger scheme of things that we're not caring about them? I've thought it's something that I kind of think about maybe too much.
Well, if I could offer a reframing. Yes. You're right. There are a lot of people behaving as if their actions don't have any consequences and doing terribly hateful things to people for no reason other than they can. And unfortunately, for a lot of reasons, the people who don't care and the people who are behaving so hatefully get a lot of attention. They get a lot of media attention, and they get a platform, which friggin' blows. The thing I think that helps me with that same feeling, because I have that feeling all the time, like, wow, I'm so worried about my behavior in this tiny little regard. And here's this motherfucker, outlawing the right of other people to exist. Yeah, I should really just not worry so much about my own behavior. That's actually not permission for me to behave poorly. What this book does is reminds me people do care. People are behaving in kind and generous and compassionate ways, but in a lot of ways, because the work they do is part of an unseen part of culture that we're not supposed to look at, we don't see it. They don't get attention. They don't get a platform, except in this book where they did. I know that there are people out there being careful and considerate and compassionate with the dead because it's the right thing to do. I will never see them. I will never see them on the news channel, but I know they're out there. And I think what this book did for me was remind me there are a lot of people behaving terribly, and there are also people who are doing wonderfully kind and righteous things.
Yeah, I think if I were to wrap up this book with an image, they talked about the huge apartment fires in London.
The Grenfell Tower fire,
the Kenyan company again. And, as they were, and how they meticulously tracked and collected all the minutia of every apartment to try and return things to the people if they wanted to. And then it ended up being where there was a fish tank that had been found in the rubble under the ashes, that some of the fish were still alive in the tank. And the family that the tank belonged to said, where they've been relocated to, they couldn't have it. So one of the employees took the fish home, and then there was a baby born, and they named the baby fish Phoenix.
Yeah.
And
now it's their company fish tank, right?
And I just, the fact that this whole kind of the compassion of the work it takes to try and track these belongings, and that this is what she does. By including those details, she weaves hope and empathy throughout the entire story.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And,
you're so right.
When you read this book that has so much darkness and death, and to have that hope weaved through is really important.
It is. I would definitely recommend this book. If this is the subject matter that someone is interested in, I would absolutely recommend this book. It is wonderfully written. It is meticulously researched. I felt like I knew the writer, but not in a way that was intrusive?
It's a skill. Like I was saying going into it, writing nonfiction like this in a way that is compelling and feels personal, but yet she doesn't upstage her subjects is a skill, and she does it well.
Very, very good. Thank you for talking about this book with me.
Yeah, I mean, I know it was when we said that we were both reading it. It was so and yeah, so you can't just bring this up at your average dinner party. Yeah.
No, but it is such a compelling and thoughtful book too. Like this person did an outstanding job writing this book, and that is really high praise.
Yeah. So if you're able to dive into it, it is definitely a good read, even if you do it a little bit every night as your bedtime reading.
Yeah, I recommend that. Thank you so much for doing this conversation with me. I was so excited to have someone to talk to about this book while I was like in the process of finishing it.